Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Victorian team at the Institute of Architects, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to today's Lean-In, Heritage and Sustainability. What we do really matters. My name is Kirby Roper and I'm from Kirby Architects, and I'm a co-chair of the Sustainable Architects Committee. Joining me today is Kim Roberts from Urbis and co-chair of the Heritage Committee. And it is our honour to be your hosts as moderators for today's Lean-In. We are joining from across the country today. I'd like to acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land. It's a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. In the Lean-In session today, it's being recorded. So if you miss anything, or if you have to leave early, we'll be publishing this recording on the Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And we'll share that link with you in our upcoming email communications. If not, just remember the title and you can always find it in a Google search. This Lean-In session enables you to ask questions from our panellists. So if you have a question or a comment, please put it in our Q&A box down below and add yours in. And we'll go through these later in the session. We've left about 20 minutes at the end. This session explores the natural and obvious coexistence of heritage thinking and environmental sustainability. This is not a new proposition. How that translates into achieving innovation, embracing the breadth of what sustainability can capture, and navigating statutory processes is the conversation that we have to have. Championing heritage is also championing sustainable outcomes. So today it's our pleasure to have a conversation with Adam Mormont and Tina Tam. Adam and Tina will have a conversation with Kim and I that establishes the current context, both here and overseas, looks at what we are trying to achieve and how that translates into built outcomes, drawing on local case studies. Adam is a director of Level 10, has 20 years' experience in professional heritage practice. He has emerged as a key participant in the development of heritage policy, heritage management planning, and conceptions of social value in heritage settings, working across projects in Victoria, Tasmania, ACT, Queensland, and New South Wales. He's well-travelled. In developing strategies for adaptive reuse of heritage buildings and policies and management guidelines for the delivery and conservation objectives in multi-layered urban contexts. Adam is conscious that heritage can serve as a catalyst for positive change at a time of considerable social and environmental flux. Tina is an architect and certified passive house designer, and she works on adaptive reuse, refurbishment, and extension of buildings, particularly heritage buildings. Many of her projects are award-winning and significant, such as the UTAS Philip Smith Centre and the Old Quad Redevelopment University at Melbourne Uni, both of which will be examples today, so you'll love that. As a designer, she is interested in the translation of ideas into buildable solutions while integrating a fabric-first approach to the retrofitting of heritage and existing buildings. She has been instrumental in Level 10's approach to sustainability, embedding it in a way the company designs and practices, making it an attitude of mind and developing evidence-based sustainability goals. I'm now going to hand over to Adam and Tina, and I look forward to all of your questions in the end.
Thank you very much, Kirby, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining. Tina, thanks for sharing the slide. I'll start by making some introductory observations. As Kirby said, clearly the issues of heritage and sustainability are related, interrelated, and always have been. Evidently, retaining and adapting heritage buildings delivers strong environmental benefits. For the purposes of this session, Tina and I are going to take a fairly broad view of the two terms. For heritage, we'd prefer to think of existing buildings, landscapes, and places, and that's not necessarily to constrain ourselves to thinking about heritage designation, and that's for reasons that we'll come back to. As regards sustainability, we've thought about UNESCO's 4 pillars of sustainability: environmental, social, economic, and cultural. And we've also found that the definition adopted by the United Nations Brundtland Commission in 1987 to be useful, where sustainability is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it's a far broader term. And clearly this relates to minimizing carbon dioxide emissions, but also access to housing, access to resources, enabling traditional uses, associations, and cultural practices to continue. And on that point, for all of us here in Australia, thoughts turn to custodianship of country on the part of First Peoples. We're going to use a series of case studies to reveal different sustainable outcomes. But before that, I wanted to provide some framing, some provocations. If you could go to that first slide, Tina. Look, there's a question as regards the sustainability of heritage. This is a quote that was coined by Rodney Harrison, the professor of heritage studies at University College London. And it's about the importance of forgetting to create space for remembering, or to put it another way, celebrating and understanding the present by letting go of aspects of the past. And he was talking about alignment, aligning communal priorities with what we choose to celebrate, choose to protect. And implicit in this analysis is a recognition that the perpetual expansion of heritage registers is or may not be sustainable, and risks diluting an appreciation of what is important. The implications of this accumulation couldn't reasonably have been anticipated 50 or 60 years ago when heritage legislation was first passed. The first act passed in Australia was the Victorian Historic Buildings Act of 1974. You could go to the next slide. Thank you. And I think it's clear that there really is quite an accumulation. There is a lot of heritage on this slide. All the places in dark pink are subject to statutory heritage controls, and that's central Melbourne. In Victoria, and I do sit in Melbourne, so sorry for the Victorian-centric reflections, but there are in the order of 2,400 places that are registered on the state register, the Victorian Heritage Register, and a further almost 190,000 places that are controlled at the local level, and that's been estimated at about 10% of building stock. And there are also places that are controlled under Commonwealth legislation. If you could go to the next slide. I also think it's worth remembering where heritage came from. It was born of protest in the 60s and early 70s, concern about the extent of change to historic urban environments and the perceived mismanagement of natural environments were societal priorities. I mean, these were the issues that got people out on the streets. The shot on the slide shows a picket line in Sydney in 1973 when the Building Labourers Federation was a major advocate for resisting development which it considered to be environmentally or socially undesirable, and that included demolition of historic buildings in the absence of heritage legislation. And today there are other priorities which variously invoke aspects of sustainability, including affordable housing, aspirations for greater urban density, reconciliation, and responding to a changing climate. And it's arguable, just by way of framing, that heritage as presently framed is poorly aligned with some of these priorities. I think that we've all seen headlines that telling us that heritage is a barrier to greater urban density, that there's too much heritage, that heritage is a problem, and we've all seen those headlines that heritage is an easy target. It's easily misunderstood. It's easily misrepresented. At Level Chen, we do try to take a longer view, and we see heritage or existing buildings as an opportunity. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. We've found the term heritage thinking to be quite useful. It's not something we've developed, but a term that has been very much adopted in academic circles and in practice. The two grabs on the slide that on the left is recent guidance from Historic England, on the right, and an academic paper promoting an embrace of heritage thinking. And heritage thinking is not, it's a concept that's central to what we do. It's what we've done for as a practice, and what heritage practitioners have done for many years, many decades. And heritage in that way has much to offer to the pressing need for greater retention and adaptation of existing buildings, which is something that we're not doing anything like fast enough to make the difference required. Over the past 50 or so years, since heritage designation, since the passage of legislation, heritage designation has been the dominant consideration in whether a building is retained or not. But that is changing. I think governments, particularly in Europe, are increasingly accepting embedded carbon as a factor in decision-making regarding proposals for the management of change to existing buildings and urban environments. On the next slide, this is the Marks and Spencer's flagship store on Oxford Street in London. And in recent years, this has been a major point of debate. No doubt some of you would have been following that. But in 2021, Marks and Spencer's lodged an application to demolish and replace its late 1920s store with Westminster Council. Permission was granted, with the council accepting. The argument that the public benefit of the new and improved store, with lower operational costs and functionality calibrated to support the ongoing vitality of London's premier retail strip, outweighed heritage and embodied carbon considerations. The council's decision was supported by the Greater London Authority, the Metropolitan Authority, but was then called in by the British government, then a Conservative administration. And the ensuing planning inquiry found that Westminster Council's decision should be overturned, arguing that replacement would fail to support the transition to a low carbon future and would overall fail to encourage the reuse of existing resources, including the conversion of existing buildings. So the message was enough's enough. If we're serious about net zero, we can't keep doing this. Unfortunately, there is a coda here. The planning inquiry's decision itself was overturned by the High Court, so Marks and Spencer's got their wish. But there was a strong sense that a line is being drawn, and I think that what we see overseas, and Britain's far from an exception, it can reasonably be anticipated to come to Australia in the not too distant future. So if you go to the next slide, I think you could probably flick over that one. Thank you. Tina, I might hand to you at this point.
Thanks, Adam. And just with this next part of the presentation, we'll probably talk more to the architect's perspective, and we'll show some case studies of how we have applied what Adam has talked about. I think the main thing is that for us as a practice, when we work with existing buildings, we do see it very much as an opportunity and not a constraint. And we do find that working with existing buildings really grounds our work and always makes it richer. And we know that heritage buildings or existing buildings are often built to last. They're often built using local materials with very little waste. And we know that keeping them is the best way of reducing our carbon emissions. This diagram here is one that we've developed internally to try and encapsulate how we see sustainability. It's really a plural concept. It's a total proposition that considers place, meaning, cultural continuity, environmental impact. And we always try and support what we're doing with research and evidence. The first case study I wanted to talk to is the Point Nepean quarantine station. And this is really about in reusing an existing building, the first step of making it feasible and the first act of creativity, I guess, is really about finding a compatible brief for the building. one that fits comfortably and can be incorporated without causing undue harm. At the quarantine station, there was a building here which was designed as an isolation ward, which had a symmetrical plan with 2 wards on either side. And as part of our work to create a facilitated camping facility, we found that it was a perfect fit for our camp kitchen, our camp reception, and in the 2 open wings, including a new set of toilets as almost like a train carriage within the volume. So this is really important as a first step in ensuring the feasibility of the project. The next one, the old quad at the University of Melbourne. This is the first state-listed building where the principles of the Passive House NFIT were applied. And it was a project which challenged what we could expect of existing buildings, which are cold and drafty and uncomfortable. It really showed that you can expect new buildings to be comfortable and to perform well thermally and be comfortable and healthy environments for people to use. In this building, I think we took advantage of the fact that the interiors had been disturbed and were no longer intact. And that gave us a really good opportunity to then install a second skin inside the building, which was airtight and highly insulated. This is the diagram of the plan showing the yellow, which is where our new thermal envelopes were, and they sat neatly behind the existing sandstone facade. As part of this with the mechanical system, we introduced fresh air, and because of the high performance of the envelope, we were able to reduce the mechanical cooling and heating demand to about 10% of what it normally would be. And the economic gain of that was that we were able to reduce the amount of plant that we had to install. And we were also able to deliver this project without having to trigger major plant upgrades to this building. And it was also a really positive heritage outcome because we can conceal all of the plant inside the roof space and not have it on the roof. These are some photos of the installation occurring. So the structural insulated panels, airtightness membrane, and then the photo to the right shows our new secondary windows on the inside. The approach was really tailored depending on the space. So in the library, where the interiors were more intact and we had existing trusses, we had to work around that and make sure that the architecture was still evident. Adam, do you want to add to this?
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, I would just add that the regulator in this case was Heritage Victoria. The old quad is included in the Victorian Heritage Register, so we didn't need to make application to Heritage Victoria. And I think fair to say they were challenged initially by the ambition to apply this NFIT outcome to the building. As Tina said, it hadn't been done before to a heritage asset in Victoria, possibly Australia. I'm not sure about that, but certainly Victoria. And in entering into discussions, as Tina said, this is a structure, a complex that's highly evolved. There are varying levels of intactness, integrity, but a critical consideration in discussions with Heritage Victoria was one that drew attention to and sought an acknowledgement of the fact that this was the primary seat. This was the origin of the university, the original university, the first university in Victoria, in Melbourne. It is a place symbolically loaded with aspirations for innovation, for learning, for ambition. And in that regard, it's an association that we referenced in making application to Heritage Victoria. And not in isolation, that was certainly not the only consideration, but it was symbolically resonant in that way and felt comfortable and appropriate as part of a recognition of an outcome that could provide new life for this asset, we hope, for the next 100 and more years, but one that built on the principles embedded within it.
Thanks, Adam. And this fabric first approach is one that we practice to various levels depending on the project. And we do apply it also to different scales of building. So in the local heritage overlay, buildings such as this, which have no internal controls, provide a really good opportunity for installing the second skin, upgrading the windows to achieve a thermally efficient building. And then at the other end of the scale at University College, we've built two entirely new wings, which were also built to the passive house principles. And it resulted in an increase of GFA. So the attic space, which would have otherwise been taken up by plant, was then able to accommodate a whole new level of student residences. We were able to avoid the upgrade of the substation, also due to the reduction of the mechanical heating and cooling. The next project is the Wade Institute of Entrepreneurship. So this is at Ormond College in Parkville. This project was really us exploring an approach of coexistence of new and existing buildings, and one that's about the new building not being compromised or having to mimic existing buildings or being hidden. The site itself is full of heritage buildings. We have the Roy Grounds Masters Lodge. We have the main building, which Heritage Victoria were very keen for us to maintain views to. And any new buildings were required to not be intrusive, not block any views to this building from the street. And we also had to work around all of these trees. On the other hand, the college needed evolution, and they needed a new building to support their postgraduate students. And so the approach that we took was that in the area of the existing tennis court, which is here, we lifted up the tennis court and introduced a new building beneath, which hosted the Wade Institute of Entrepreneurship. What this meant was that we were building on the disturbed ground, which limited the impact of the trees. And the breakthrough was really in the construction, which then became the architecture of the building. We knew that if we raised the tennis court, that we would need to build a fence around the tennis court, and the mesh of that fence then became our structure. It was a stainless steel structure that was constructed of stainless steel rods, and it allowed the building to be present but also invisible. As you can see here with the mesh, it allows the reflections and the light of the mesh to camouflage the building. And so when it sits next to the existing building, the building sits side by side, and this building has its own identity and is it is present but also invisible. Did you want to add to that, Adam?
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, I think that issue, just going again to the interaction between the two aspects of the two sides of Level Chen, with both the architects and heritage consultants, and that this was a project that evolved very much as an outcome of negotiation and discussion internally, but also critically with the Wade Institute and Ormond College. But in navigating a pathway through this, as Tina said, a key consideration and one issue that needed to be managed very much from a heritage perspective was that the issue of views, to maintain views from the public realm to the 19th century college. And in any conventional sense, in a heritage setting, the traditional expectation is one that would see new works and change introduced behind the primary heritage asset. As you all have seen from the previous slides, that was not possible at this site. So we had to recognize that a different approach would be required. And it was one that was negotiated through discussion with Heritage Victoria. And the other sort of aspect of, impact on significance, and it's something that we think about in every proposal for change. We are required to do that under legislation, whether that's at the state level, as is the case here, or at the local level. And in terms of impacts on significance, occasionally a slightly nebulous concept and can be difficult to understand. But here again, similar to the old quad, there is a really well-established tradition of innovation and diversity, and the establishment of the Wade Institute are very much aligned with that tradition, that those associations and that sense of identity and mission and purpose, and enabled Ormond College through the introduction of the Wade Institute to perpetuate those associations and for those associations to be amplified. And it's actually the 10th anniversary of the Wade Institute this year. It's been a really successful institution, and I think a really successful outcome from a heritage perspective as well, Tina.
Yeah, and I think the idea of using the stainless steel structure as the structure and making that the identity of the architecture is a really neat continuation of the modernist themes of the grounds building, and it also allowed us to reduce the amount of fabric or construction that we were doing. So it's a different way of thinking about how you can try and build buildings to a lower budget with less material. So I'll move on. The next project is the Utah's Domain Campus. This is the Philip Smith Center. This project was really about doing as much of work as we could during the design process to try and build as little as possible. So this building was one which had been built as a teaching facility, but had then experienced many lives as different uses over time and was now being converted back to a classroom. And as usual, when we start looking at a building, there are all the compliance requirements with the services, with the structure, such as seismic and floor loading, and also environmental performance. And in this instance, we took a lot of time at the start of the project to understand what the condition was of the building. We looked at all of the sprinkler pipes and did an audit to work out whether they could be reused so we didn't have to tear up the floor. This English bond pattern of the external walls we'd found, the structural engineer found, was actually inherently seismically braced and allowed us to keep it as it is. We also looked at the timber floor joists based on all the historical drawings and worked out what the floor loadings were. And having all of this information really empowered us to make a case for retaining as much of the fabric as possible, doing it as little as possible, and was really made possible because we had a really great team of collaborators, of engineers, building surveyors, and services engineers. We also did use the tools that were available at hand so that we had evidence to support what we were doing. We did a comfort analysis here to work out what the temperatures would be like in the building after we'd done our building fabric upgrades. And what it told us was that in actual fact, most of the levels of the building don't need heating and cooling. They only need heating, and only the attic required cooling. So this was really important in a building where there were no false ceilings or no bulkheads where we could conceal any mechanical services. And it allowed us to be really controlled where we introduced plant. And then the other thing that we introduced were infilling these verandas, so that verandas which were previously too cold and too windy to use were now enclosed with these guillotine windows, which the occupants could open and close, and basically maximizing the spaces that we could use in the building. And this is just a photo of before we started the work and a photo of afterwards. So the intent of keeping it to a light touch, and really it was more of a process of stripping back than adding, was quite successful here.
I think it's, Tina, a really good example of that term heritage thinking that we referenced earlier, where taking the time to truly understand the building in terms of its construction technologies, its inherent embodied values, as well as the the heritage significance that attaches to the building through its inclusion in the Tasmanian register, that total understanding of the embodied characteristics and qualities of the building, as well as the values that attach to it, being historical, cultural, associational, whatever they may be, it enabled you, as you say, to do as little as possible in seeking to reactivate the building and breathe new life into it. So I think it's a really good example of that concept of how heritage thinking it can be really productive as a process, and we're not resisting an existing condition, we're actually embracing it and knowing as much as we can about it before starting work.
And I think the case of reusing buildings is really evident here. We did some embodied carbon analysis. The first one is really just comparing standard materials compared with what we introduced as best practice. But the thing that is really quite evident here is that this is a calculation of if we were to reconstruct the building, how much upfront carbon would be created versus what we did, where we kept the existing structure and introduced as little as possible. The theme of repair was also very strong here in this Philip Smith Centre and also throughout the site. There is a lot of stonework to the facades, which was well overdue for its next round of maintenance. And so we took an approach of looking at each block on a case-by-case basis so that we could work out a way. We scoped it in a way so that we could keep as much fabric intact as possible. But we're also aware that the next round of maintenance works probably wouldn't occur for another 25 years or more. And so we needed to allow for that lifespan in any work that we did. And then across the rest of the site, the UTAS campus, the domain campus, is where UTAS was founded. So we have, in the process of doing the master plan and the landscape design, looked at reconciling the history of UTAS's founding home with what this place was for the Moanina people and Palawa people. And it's really a next step to the apology stone that the Vice-Chancellor has installed there. The last project we'll talk to is Tower Hill. It's probably best known for the Robin Boyd designed visitor centre, which has the roof that evokes the cones of the volcanoes. We were commissioned to do the refurbishment of this building, and in the process found ourselves looking at the amenities block too and advocating for its retention. I think this project was about not necessarily accepting that if a building is not listed that it can be removed, and really questioning whether it should be removed before we take that default approach. This is the amenities block, which was not listed. It was damp, it was not functional and not meeting the brief that EMAC, who are the future users, needed. They wanted a space that they could host learning on country programs and tours around the Tower Hill Reserve. We also needed to provide compliant toilets. And what we did was that we looked at the building for its merits and we worked out how we could make it work really hard to achieve what we needed to achieve. So the building here, what we looked at doing was we compressed the planning of the toilets so that we could provide the compliant facilities and then provide this flexible education space so that EMAC could continue to use the building. And so while this building isn't listed and the visitor centre is listed, I think it has been an important process in retaining this building because of its merits from an environmental perspective, its connection with the visitor centre, and also all of the social history associated with that. So it's been quite a positive outcome. Adam, did you want to add any closing thoughts?
Look, just to add, Tina, that I agree very much. It's been an incredibly positive outcome. And just reflecting on the toilet the amenities block that, as you say, was initially contemplated for replacement, and through negotiation with the client, there was an ability to persuade them of the merits of taking a different approach and working with an existing condition to deliver a positive outcome. There's sort of advocacy dimension to that work, and we were lucky to have a great client to work with, someone who was open to ideas and really happy to embrace a different way of thinking. So no, I think it's a really good example to give and rich in terms of the issues that confront us all in navigating where we are from a perspective of heritage as attached to country, as attached to European traditions, and as attached to ambitions for improvements associated with embodied carbon and embodied value. So I think it's a really good example of many of the issues that we've sort of touched on through this introductory session today.
And that's the end of our presentation.
Thanks so much, Tina and Adam. They're a really amazing array of case studies and really interesting thoughts about this issue of question of how sustainability intersects with heritage. Certainly, myself, as Kirby introduced me before, I'm a co-chair of the Heritage Committee, architect and heritage consultant. I have, been accredited with sustainability tools in the past. It's certainly not my main focus at the moment, but for me, they've always worked hand in hand. But I've been realizing recently that a lot of people don't see it the same way. Tina, I was just wondering about you as an architect coming to heritage, and obviously what you work within Lovell Chen, so that is a main focus of the business. How have you come to terms, I guess, with that kind of heritage thinking that Adam's talked about? How has it influenced your architectural practice?
I mean, it's part of what we do every day, and I think most of the projects that we work with are existing buildings, so we don't see it as a constraint, as I said earlier, but I think the research and understanding the building is really important. It helps us, I think understanding the nature of the building, the planning, the principles of it, the architectural intent really guides what we do as the intervention. We always want to do something that is harmonious with it and respects what is in the building's best interest. So I think that really guides us, and we find that when you are working with an existing building, there's this shared purpose between us and our team of collaborators, and there's a common goal of how we can retain and reuse this building and extend the life and give it another life, basically.
Fantastic. There's a question, a technical question in the chat that I'm going to direct to you. There's a question, I think it popped up when you were talking about the Wade Institute and Melbourne Uni, some of them had it, and it's a question regarding existing windows and how you manage condensation in relation to variable temperatures when you've got an existing heritage facade.
I think that was probably in relation to the old quad, where we kept the existing steel framed windows and the sandstone facade or sandstone veneer facade, and then we introduced the second skin behind. The way we managed condensation was that there was a ventilation cavity between our inner skin and the outer skin, so that moisture and air could actually move, and there was an ability for any condensation that did occur to drip down and be collected within the subfloor. And we did hydrothermal analysis to work out where those condensation points were so that we could design to avoid it.
And has there been any post-occupancy kind of review of any of those measures?
I think we've done quite a lot of work on Old Quad since that first stage was done. We haven't formally commissioned a occupancy analysis. We would love to, but from visually seeing it, we haven't seen any evidence of condensation there. Yep.
It's probably been reported by now.
Mm.
Look, both of you, there is a lot of your case studies were focused on state-listed buildings, and it strikes me that the kind of first principles approach that you take with working through the information, both from a heritage and a sustainability perspective, it really lends itself to that kind of borough charter approach and the principles-based approach. When we go into a local statutory climate, I guess sometimes that can be a bit more prescriptive for architects in terms of working through those issues. How do you think, in terms of the cases you've had to develop to present to state government authorities, state government heritage bodies, how have you learnt that you could take into a local government statutory system? How would you present the cases there too when you've got a more prescriptive series of heritage policies?
Thanks, Kim. Are you happy for me to respond to that, Tina?
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Kim. Look, the principles do apply in a general sense. If from the perspective of heritage, you've got an existing condition that has been identified as a building, often typically of either historic and or architectural significance. And so the attribution of significance is central to the management of change. And so the principles do apply. I think the point that you're making is that at the state level, certainly in Victoria, there's a far more total application of controls. So controls apply to the external presentation of a building as well as to the interior and to their settings. It's a more holistic approach, and as you say, principles driven. At the local level, under the Planning and Environment Act, through planning schemes at the metropolitan level, the same principles apply, but as you say, filtered through the prism of the planning scheme, it can appear prescriptive, and I think we would all reflect that it's not a perfect system. In many cases, the assessments are incomplete or a little out of date, and I think one of the case studies Tina gave earlier was locally controlled, and as she mentioned, it was just the control applies to the external presentation. It doesn't apply to the interior. It's the sort of total proposition is not quite the same. But the principles, I think, would be understood as having application. The processes do differ. It is it's as I say, not a perfect system. But I think if I could just add where regardless of state designation or the local level, I think that where heritage projects work well is where there is a shared foundation, is where the heritage is recognized and accepted as a common foundation. Otherwise, you can get a situation where different disciplines are pulling in different directions. You conservators looking at the fabric, heritage specialists looking at meaning, and designers looking at future use. I think that heritage, regardless of the level of significance, it provides that foundation where the whole team works from the same understanding of what the place is and why it matters. It becomes a sort of center of gravity.
Yeah, that struck me when you were both talking, actually, that, that maybe being less siloed about the values that we're talking about attached to a building is probably important. And when we were discussing this session last week, Adam, we talked about existence value, which is talking about the what is used in environmental heritage terms, that there is inherent value in an object and its relationship to an environment. And strikes me that perhaps we need to be a little less siloed in how we talk about values of environmental buildings, including cultural values, the 4 pillars of sustainability, environmental, economic, cultural, social. Unfortunately, it seems to be the cultural and social that sometimes drops up in those discussions about sustainability, and maybe we need more ways of talking about those things. But this leads to a really interesting question that's popped up in the chat about in this area about how do you convince the client when the building is not heritage listed? So again, this value, and the client doesn't consider a building to be significant enough from a heritage point of view, and I take it to retain it So what I think maybe, Tina, some of those fantastic graphs you had might go some way to talk to that. Just what is the value about in retention of a building?
I mean, I think cost is a big factor, and I think being able to demonstrate to them what the work, or being able to scope a sensible scope for them that gets them what they need, and having that costed and presented to them is useful, because I think it might actually end up being less or more easier to achieve than what people might imagine. I think the other consideration is that buildings, heritage buildings or existing buildings, a lot of the time they were built to last, and they're also built with higher ceilings. They were built a lot of the time to the boundary. And if you were to knock that down and rebuild it, you probably wouldn't be able to get the same generous volumes or be able to build to that area again, particularly if you're having to build to the res code setbacks. I think we've had quite a few projects where the houses weren't actually listed, and the clients had a sentiment towards the building. There was it had been in the family for quite some time, and they took it upon themselves to keep it and upgrade the fabric so that they could live in it as their forever home. So I think those ones were easy sells, but I think it's also about being able to tailor what the works are for the client. I think some buildings just can't hold the amount of work that you need to do to get it to be fully compliant. So being able to find that middle ground that doesn't cause too much harm to the building, gives you the most value for money, is probably what the client wants. And we do use graphs, as you said. We like to have evidence so that we know what we're doing actually is making a difference. And there's always like a values assessment. For the Philip Smith Centre, we looked at whether or not reglazing the windows was going to achieve any benefit, and we found it was negligible. So we decided not to proceed with that. So it's I think balancing all of the considerations and just finding that right tailored approach to show them that it is possible.
And you really could apply that to any building, couldn't you?
You can, yeah. Everything
As
is
an initial,
scalable.
because one of the things you spoke about, and you've both covered or repeated in every project, is establishing that brief, the wants, and understanding that site context before you start.
Yeah. And and understanding what the architecture is, and working with the merits of that is important too.
What it lends itself to.
Yeah, exactly.
A question here about case studies in hotter climates in regions further north, Darwin, Townsville, etc. Have you got any examples that you've worked on, any warm climate buildings that you could share or that you know of?
I don't think so. Not off the top of my head.
Not
Sorry.
off the top of my head. We might need to do some research. I'm sure they exist.
Sure.
I can't think of any off the top of my head either, but I'm sure they exist. And sometimes, older buildings have climatic controls built into them, even mechanical systems that have sometimes over the years been undermined, and sometimes you can open those up when you've got cools basically stored under the building to tap into again. Another question about carbon calculations. So what are the upfront carbon calculations tools that are suitable for projects like adaptive reuse and heritage?
So with the UTAS project, we use the Green Star calculator, and that I think it's kind of like an Excel spreadsheet where you put in the quantities of all of the materials that you are using and what's in the existing building. I think there are some shortfalls to that, in that it uses a database of standard materials as the gauge. So it's about comparing what you're doing compared to standard practice. So it's not quite clear sometimes what the line of standard practice is, but we we have in our own office as well used a program called Tally, which is like a Revit plugin, and it allows you to in real time. It actually measures what is in your model and tells you what the embodied energy of that. So that's quite a fluid process and is something that architects can use in-house.
Because I think sometimes it's the calculation of embodied energy in any element that goes missing in some of those tools. The second part of that question was that about the limited works to existing fabric, the implication being maybe they don't get calculated as fully. And then the question, it sounds like, if these tools being used in any stage of the project, I take it you use it through the life of the project to continue calculating?
Yes, you definitely can use it at each stage of the project, definitely. I think the shortfall of the calculators is that it doesn't quite capture what you're not building. And I think that's very much what we try and do. We try and not build it in the first place rather than specifying something that's of a low carbon. So
that's right. So reuse or dismantling and crushing a certain component can kind of factor on a calculator, whereas retention doesn't necessarily. It's an issue. Next question we've got is about managing the potential risks of working with existing fabric. So we've got asbestos, structures not designed to accommodate new works, extent of works triggering further NCC compliance issues. You got any comments about that? It's a balancing act, right?
Yes, I mean, it is. I think asbestos, it is always a risk. I think if you do the due diligence and get the reports, then you're being as informed as you can. I think there are ways to manage the other risks with structures not achieving loads, and what was the other one?
NCC.
NCC compliance. I think it's about having a good team of services engineers and structural engineers who can work with you, who don't just throw the book back at you. Building surveyors too.
Building surveyors, yeah. I was going to say the same thing.
Often
collaborating on those problems can work out the best solutions.
Yeah, exactly. I think often we will end up looking at performance solutions. They might refer to standards that were compliant when the systems were installed to help demonstrate that it is still suitable for use. So that's what we did with the sprinkler system at the Philip Smith Centre. I think the other thing that we did was that we went and measured the joists and found out what kind of timber it was so that we knew what the floor loading was. So I think having the information is really important.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is a bit of a theme from the kind of initial kind of understanding the building, documenting that process, and then documenting the other processes to build a case for any discretionary kind of requirements to do with the building at any point of the project becomes really important. How do you build a case for these interventions or lack of intervention?
Exactly.
Yeah. Kirby, did you have any questions here, or?
Apart from the other one, I think we've covered a number of them. What I loved from our initial talk, and you covered it again today, really well. The thing that's resonated with me most today is the more you know in those early stages, the more you can achieve, and the more savings you can put around them. And I think all the examples you've given show that what architects do bring to the picture very succinctly is that lateral thinking. You know, I love that in the UTAS, you only have mechanical heat recovery. You don't have heating and cooling on top of it, that the building itself is doing the work. I think, and I love the fact that you could apply those principles and that thinking to any building in evaluating it from the initial brief. Sorry, that really wasn't a question. Is there anything you would add to that to people in the thinking to take away from today's session? Was probably my question.
Adam, do you want to start?
Well, I might respond to that by reflecting on the interaction that we've referenced. Level Chen, we are we are a multidisciplinary office. We do have conservators, we have architects, we have historians, planners. It's multidisciplinary, and I think that is reflective of another aspect of this discussion, that the richness of existing conditions requires, plural understandings of plural disciplines to optimize the outcomes and to understand to the fullest extent possible the possibilities that an existing condition presents. So I think that working collaboratively, recognizing that on some occasions we'll have the answers in-house, but not on all occasions. There will be requirements to reach out to others in the sector and recognize that we don't have all the answers, but we know what the questions are, and we hope that we can identify the people who do have the answers. So I think a collaborative model is really key, and I think that, as Tina's articulated through the case studies, drawing on expertise external to the office is a really important dimension of what we do.
And yeah, I think sometimes asking the right questions is a really key consideration, because you can usually outsource those. Once you've identified a question, you can find the people you need to collaborate with to answer those questions. Just in the last few minutes, if we haven't got any more questions popped up, maybe it's worth turning that on its head, Adam. So, often as a heritage consultant, you might be working with other architects, not working in this cozy environment with Tina where you can workshop things. What can you say about, for another architect who's kind of got a project that may be heritage, or maybe a building where they're considering retaining where it might need some heritage thinking, that information space and the flow of information, what do you need to know when?
Well, this is going to be a very self-serving response, Kim. But I would advocate, and I'm sure Tina would too, that the sooner you can engage with a heritage consultant or an historian, someone who can ground you and provide an understanding of the place, its meaning, and the sooner you can integrate into your project those aspects and ambition to understand the place as a foundation to making the right decisions about giving it new life, the better. It's really, we find it to be foundational, and necessarily so. So where we work on a lot of projects where an architect would give us a call and say, we have this exciting project, it's got a heritage control, can you help us understand the do's and don'ts, opportunities, constraints? That's great. We would always welcome those discussions at the earliest possible stage. And I think it's going to the point that we were making earlier, that it is important to recognize when you don't have the answers. I think that knowing what you can do to provide those foundational, to provide a foundation for a project is important. But where there's a need to reach out beyond the four walls and to think laterally around what is in the best interests of this place, that's a question that's, I think, pretty central to every project that we work on. We recognize that heritage legislation isn't always perfect. It can't be. It's a complex space. Heritage is grounded in conceptions of nostalgia, sentiment, connection to place. It's an emotive issue. So I think that if you accept that and challenge assumptions, I think it can be really productive.
Great. Well, that's almost our time, unless you've got any further questions of each other or or any thoughts that have come out from this discussion.
Tina, have you got any final thoughts?
I think it's been a real pleasure to reflect on our projects and speak to you today and everybody about it. So thank you for your time, and we hope you got something out of it.
Really appreciate this. And look, this is a conversation that Kirby and I have been talking about, and we would like to continue. So Kirby, hopefully we'll be able to say, watch this space. We'd really like to have some further discussions on this topic later in the year as a collaboration between the Heritage Committee and the Sustainability Committee.
Yeah, it'd be great to hear what people are interested in particular, and maybe we can focus a bit more on those topics, as we've just tried to keep everything high level today.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is an opening foray to some further thinking about this issue would be really great. over to you, Kirby, to sign us
If
off.
you want to deep dive anyone, please send it in now to the chat, or you can reach out to us via the Vic chapter or directly. But we would love your feedback as to where to take this. There is so much that we can do on this combined topic, particularly our built environment, and we'd love to continue to do that. But thank you, Adam and Tina, so much for today. It has been such a pleasure in both the lead up to it and the presentation that you have done.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.